Good morning. It's really good to be with you again. This morning's Gospel reading is based on a parable, and as we know, parables are stories where Jesus used the imagery of things that people knew well to pass on a particular message. This morning's parable of the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, depending on which version you look at, is no exception. In fact, the practice of getting even with your neighbours, a bit like putting graffiti on their walls or something like that, was so prevalent that the Romans passed a law against it. The seed that they planted was a ryegrass, and it was almost identical to wheat as it first grew. And it wasn't until the seed heads started to form that the farmer could tell that it was there. Just to add insult to injury, the seeds were poisonous and caused all sorts of problems. They weren't fatal, but certainly upset the system quite badly. In the story, Jesus talks about an enemy coming and sowing the seeds at night, and then the farmer looking for advice as to what to do to sort out the problem. And the advice comes back that you leave the wheat and the weeds to grow together, and at the end, then you separate the wheat from the weeds, and the weeds are burnt and the wheat is stored in the barn. I think the first thing that speaks to me about this, from this story, is the fact it's a case of judgment. It's the judgment of the farmer. If he got it wrong and started to try and pull up the weeds, then he would also pull up the wheat and would be damaging the very thing that he was trying to nurture. And so it is when God looks at us, he expects us not to judge other people too quickly, too readily, but to let him be the judge. There's a saying somewhere in the Bible about judge not lest ye be judged, and that's certainly part of this story. I suppose there's something deep down inside us that wants to separate the sheep from the goats, the saints from the sinners, the good guys from the bad guys. And so unconsciously, I think we sometimes set ourselves up as gatekeepers. We practice almost a selective evangelism. We do this unconsciously, it's not a deliberate act. And we tend to, it's a bit like birds of a feather flocking together, isn't it? And we politely discourage those who are not quite like us. It's a rather sad judgment that we sometimes fall into. I'm reminded of the Puritans who made a concerted effort to purge the church of all who weren't pure in faith and so didn't belong. Well, they failed, and I for one am glad that they did, because if there was no place in churches for sinners who needed to be accepted and loved, there would be no place for you and me in our churches today. We live in a world where good and bad live side by side, and it will be God who lifts us gently in his hands to enjoy the salvation that is promised to us. But that is for the future. Until then, the wheat and the weeds grow side by side, even within us, so that to root out one would be to destroy the other. Ultimately, there will come a day of judgment, and as Jesus said in the parable, let both grow together until harvest, and in the harvest time I will tell the reapers, first gather the weeds, bind them into bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. The good news is God's grace is seen in the fact that as we grow in knowledge of God's love and slowly but surely humble ourselves before God and seek his will for our lives, we increasingly reflect the image of God in which we were created. And our human sinfulness, though it never completely goes away, becomes fainter and fainter by comparison to the light of God's grace and love. I suppose the bottom line is that there will always be weeds among the wheat, a little sinfulness in our souls, but thanks be to God, the harvest will be plentiful, and we shall feast sumptuously on the bread of life. And by the way, those stalks of the wheat and the darnel, or the weeds which were planted, what happened to them? Well, once the grain had been separated from the stems, the stalks were bundled and burned as fuel for cooking and heating. And that poisonous seed, the Greeks managed to find a medicinal use for it. In God's sight, nothing is useless. Nothing is lost. In God's hands, evenly the dastardly deed of the vengeful neighbour can serve a useful purpose. All things work together for good. Thanks be to God. Amen.